moment or two, I'm going to ask you to split up. Those of you who have signed up to the Faith Formation stream of our sessions, at our Faith Academy sessions this evening, you'll be going through into the hall, the main hall, and those who have signed up for Faith and Culture will be staying here. We'll come back together about 8:15 or so, and there's tea and coffee here for us as well afterwards. But before we do that, I want the three gentlemen who are leading us in these sessions to just come up to the front and join me just here, and just to introduce yourselves to everybody and tell us the parts that you'll be doing. So I'm going to, David, you've already got a microphone there, so I'll pass this microphone to the other David. And so, David, we'll start with you. If you would tell us just a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what you'll be looking at in these sessions with us.
And I don't need you. Yeah, you can hear me well.
Okay.
No, that's good. David Livingston, and I have been teaching for most of my life at Queen's University, and will be released officially at the end of this month when I enter full retirement, which is much to be looked forward to. I'm a member of Fitzroy Presbyterian Church congregation across there, and I've spent a good deal, I think, of my life in the academic world, thinking about history of ideas, the relationship between science and faith and things of that sort. And so for the two sessions that I'll be examining over these couple of weeks, I'll be looking at the way in which science has brought many advantages but many challenges to us in the 21st century. In this first little series tonight, and then in a couple of weeks' time I'll be thinking of the challenges that are being posed to us on every side by environmental problems, matters to do with climate change and the like, and some of the ways in which these ideas have been put to some extremely poor and I suppose challenging uses. So it'll be science tonight, and it'll be matters of the environment in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you. And David, you're dealing with a slightly different thing. You're in our Faith Formation stream. Will you share with people just your background, David, and then what you'll be looking at in the sessions that we're going to be sharing?
Okay, David McElrath. I'm married to Doris. We've 4 children, and I think of 6 or 7 grandchildren. Can't remember offhand. We live just beside the funeral undertaker, not in, up the King's Road. You know where that is. I retired from the ministry 15 years ago, but I'm not retired. I'm still doing a wee bit of work here and there, pulpit supplies, and with Graham Connor, who some of you will know, I've been doing a bit of work up in Tullycarnet in terms of revitalisation and church replanting, which has been a huge challenge, but we're really enjoying it. So I was there this morning, and I'm simply looking at spiritual formation. I've looked at bits and pieces of this. The Lord has taught me a lot, really, over the past 20 years ago with regard to being formed into the likeness of Jesus. And I suppose what this stream is about is simply the stuff we do to look more like Jesus. That's it. Yeah.
Lastly, Stephen, would you share with us a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you're planning to share with us in the sessions you'll be looking at?
I will, and I'm very glad to be here. You and I, Graham, go back, I think, about 25 years now, don't we? I'm Stephen Williams. I used to teach at Union Theological College, taught theology there for a number of years, which is where we met a long time ago. And I still occasionally refer to your master's thesis, Graham. But having said that, I'll move on.
In positive or negative terms, Stephen?
I still can't understand that sentence on page 66.
Okay.
I'm not serious. I retired from Union in 2017, sorry. long time ago. So I'm still active. I taught theology over the years. I've interested myself also in ethics and in history of thought. Those are my main areas. And I'm joining David Livingston here for that particular stream, and looking at 2 things. One is transhumanism, and that's a word unfamiliar to many people, and people tend to think it has to do with transgenderism, but it's something quite different. Transhumanism is about a whole way of viewing the technological enhancement of human beings, and it's a philosophy which is quite pervasive in many ways. I want to talk about that. And then in the last session, the second and last of mine, looking at the question of artificial intelligence, trying to think in Christian perspective about both transhumanism and artificial intelligence, which is so very, very pervasive and takes many, many forms, the issues connected with that. So I think that probably is all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us for these sessions. We're delighted to have you with us and sharing with us, and we look forward to what you're going to be doing in the weeks to come. Before we split, I'm going to pray for these three men at the beginning of these sessions, that God will continue to guide and lead them in what they share with us. So let's pray together. Father God, we thank you for the three gentlemen standing before us this evening. We thank you for all they have to contribute to the life of the church, not just in this congregation or in the congregations from which they come, but the wider church family, the wider church within this island. Lord, we thank you so much for what they continue to contribute, and we pray that as we engage with them and the ideas that they'll be bringing to us over these weeks, that you will use them to bear fruit in us and in this congregation. So we ask that as we go into these sessions now, you will be the one leading us and guiding us, and it will be to you that the glory goes. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, folks, so what we're going to ask you to do is, those of you who are in the faith formation sessions with David McElrath, you'll be going through these doors and into the Forbes Hall. And then those of you who are staying here with David Livingstone, simply stay here. But I would suggest that if you're staying here, you maybe move forward a bit as well, so that, and David's nodding there, so move forward so that he can engage with you as well. So let's take 5 minutes to do that now, and then we'll get our session started.
Oh, I will. No, believe you me, I will. We're not ready to go yet, are we? Well, I'd like to I'd like to thank Graham for welcoming all of us here to this series, and for his words of welcome to me. I'm not going to thank my son-in-law, though, Paul Lutton, because it's his fault that I'm here at all. So if you want to blame anybody, Paul's the man to blame. So anyway, what I wanted to do with this group tonight, and I hope it'll be as much of a dialogue as anything else, is to take you through some of the challenges of modern-day science. I mean, I'm not going to get into too much technical scientific talk. What I'm really more interested in are the ideas that have been floating around and the way in which it seems to have informed all of our outlooks. And I think that Christian people really have to think more seriously about the blessings but also the challenges of modern science, especially as we move into the 21st century. And some of the things that I will be saying later on will have some relevance for what Stephen will be talking about with respect to artificial intelligence and the like. So please direct all your questions to him afterwards. So this is just a little kind of a mosaic of some of the figures that I'll be talking about, and the exam afterwards will require you, before you're allowed to go home, to identify who all these figures actually are. I want to begin by going back just a few years to 2008 and to this figure here, Professor Michael Rice, who in 2008, as a professor, was working for Britain's premier scientific society, the Royal Society. and he was its communications officer. He is a professor of science communication and science education in one of the London universities. Now, what happened to Michael was kind of interesting because it made news headlines in the Times. The Royal Society's Michael Rice resigns over creationism row. Now, I don't want to get into the details about creationism and that old story tonight. Just suffice to say that he had been speaking on one occasion and said that he felt that in schools there should be some open discussion about alternative ways of thinking about the development of life. He, of course, himself has no difficulty with the theory of evolution or whatever, but he just raised this question that because matters of creation are very much in the culture, that it would be wise to address them to some degree in the school system. Now, I should have said he has an additional title, not just Professor Michael Rice, but the Reverend Professor Michael Rice. And it was the reaction to this that struck me as particularly instructive. At the time when he had made some of these comments and they made headlines, there were calls for his resignation from the Royal Society as its communications person by some people that I'll itemize in a minute, indicating a culture war between what people think scientists believe and what they think religious people believe. Here are just two examples. One of them was from, and I'll read this because the screen is a little bit smaller than I had hoped, Sir Richard Roberts, a Nobel laureate, and he had this to say. We gather Professor Rice is a clergyman, which in itself, Paul, is very worrisome. And I'd really hoped that Graham would have been in for that comment so we could all share our worry together. Who on earth thought that he would be an appropriate director of education, who could be expected to answer questions about the differences between science and religion in a scientific, reasoned way? Now, of course, it didn't occur at all to Sir Richard that if someone had said, who would have thought that a scientist would be an appropriate director of education who could speak reasonably about religion? No, the whole bias of this is somehow the scientist is the person who is objective. They're the person who's got the right answer. They are the community, or that is the community, and the only community that can speak in a scientific and reasoned way. The presumption being that science is the right way to think about these problems. Now, this is a Nobel laureate, and this letter was written, published in the newspapers, and sent to the president of the Royal Society. Let me remind you, the Royal Society is Britain's premier scientific society. Sir Harold Kroto was another Nobel laureate, and this is what he had to say. There is no way that an ordained minister for whom unverified dogma must represent a major, if not the major pillar in their lives. There's no way that they can present free-thinking, doubt-based scientific philosophy honestly or disinterestedly. Now, what I'm trying to just say here is that towards 2008, 2010, you can see the continuation of an old culture war, with the assumption of a necessary conflict, a necessary warfare between practitioners of science and those who have a faith commitment. And in order to resolve these differences, the assumption is that the only way to resolve them is in the language of science, not in any other kind of vocabulary, not in, for example, thinking about these matters theologically. Now, what I found so interesting and shocking about this, that even this was too much for Richard Dawkins, of all people, famous, of course, for his diatribes against faith, his diatribes against religion, and his championing of science being the only way to guide us into the future. Now, we can't read any of this, but even he found these comments, these challenges, to be a bit too much. Let's see if I can see one of the things he said here. He said, unfortunately for him, Michael Rice, as a would-be spokesman for the Royal Society, Michael Rice is also an ordained minister. To call for his resignation on those grounds, as several Nobel Prize-winning fellows are now doing, can you believe this, comes a little too close to a witch hunt for my squeamish taste. So even he felt that things were going just a wee bit too far in this attack on all religion by these two Nobel laureates. So I'm really beginning here by saying that there certainly is a conflict or a culture war that's going on between advocates of science and technology and people of faith. Now, what I thought it would be interesting to do just for a little while is to look a little bit at how people have, over the years, thought about the relationship between science and faith. A little bit of how we might go about telling the story of the long-term relationship between the scientific enterprise and faith communities. And I suppose, whilst many within the church challenge this now, and I mean, I've done this for years in talks myself, I still think that in the mind of the general public, the assumption still is that there is a conflict between science and religion. Somehow, the idea that to be a really brilliant scientist, you have to shed all of those primeval, barbaric ideas about religion and buy into a new, rational way of thinking about the world. And this really goes back, I think, to at least something like this, the very famous scene in, I think, 1633, when Galileo, who believed indeed that the earth was revolving around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth, was called before the Inquisition and was condemned for heresy and spent the rest of his days in a kind of, not exactly a prison, a kind of open prison where he continued to conduct experiments on various sorts of things. But for this reason, people thought there was a conflict, a necessary conflict between science and religion. And I suppose from that day to this, that narrative has continued to dominate our consciousness. There are many problems with it, and I'll mention one or two of these in a minute. But what tended to happen through the centuries was this notion of a warfare, a struggle, a conflict between science and religion gripped many people's imaginations. Let me just mention a couple of these very famous books that came out, I suppose, in the later part of the 19th century. The first one by John William Draper. That's him up there on this side, John William Draper. And he wrote this book here, The Conflict Between Science and Religion. This one by Andrew Dixon White, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, and then other books by various people, landmarks in the struggle between science and religion on the left-hand side. Now, it's works of this sort that cemented in people's minds, in the era of Charles Darwin, that there was an inevitable and an inexorable conflict between science and faith. A couple of little quotations to illustrate some of the things that I have in mind here. Here's John William Draper. The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers. The expansive force of the human intellect on one side and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. My son-in-law is clearly on one side of this dark ignorance. Faith is in its nature unchangeable, stationary. Science is in its nature progressive, and eventually a divergence between them, impossible to conceal, must take place. Notice the certainty here. I mean, there's no possibility of cooperation. There's no possibility of dialogue. This conflict must take place. And on the other hand, Andrew Dixon White, in all modern history, interference with science in the supposed interest of religion, no matter how conscientious such interference may have been, has resulted in direct evils both to religion and to science, and invariably. And on the other hand, all untrammeled scientific investigation, no matter how dangerous to religion some of its stages may have seemed for the time to be, has invariably resulted in the highest good both of religion and science. And now you just have to pause for a minute and think, I wonder, is that true? Modern science has given us the atomic bomb. Hard to describe that as the highest good of both religion and science. It has brought about the devastation of the environment through technological achievements of one sort and another. Is that an untrammeled good? I say this simply to say this has become part of popular consciousness, and if in a series like this we're trying to think how faith relates to modern culture, I think these views would be shared by the vast number of people in the general public. I did begin there talking a minute ago about Richard Dawkins. He absolutely belongs to this school of thought, and I have to say, much to my shame, that his books sell an awful lot better than mine do. So his message is certainly going around the place much better than mine. But he had this to say on one occasion: faith seems to me to qualify as a kind of mental illness. I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but sadly harder to eradicate. So you think to yourself, Richard, so what do you really mean here? It's not too hard to detect. So that's one of the narratives. That's one of the ways of thinking about science and religion, an inevitable conflict and inevitable struggle. But historians of science and religion have been recently telling us that this is not really a proper way to think about the history of science and faith at all. And they have suggested that rather than thinking of it as a story of conflict, much more likely is that there were many moments of cooperation. One of the things that came to light, I suppose it would be 50 or 60 years ago now by some historians, is that when you go back to the time of Galileo and the struggle over the heliocentric system, the sun-centered system, was that many religious groups were engaging in scientific inquiry. The Catholic Church, for example, was the home of an enormous amount of observational astronomy. Whether they were interested in the heliocentric system or not, it didn't matter. They were very committed to pursuing natural knowledge. And this was also the case with the English Puritans. They were involved in, here's a Puritan village, I think, in New England, and an illustration of looking at a meteorite and so on, so that you got Puritans, for example, here, writing, this is Cotton Mather on a Christian philosopher, which was a collection of studies of nature. And then you get historians like Robert Merton speaking about the advance and contribution to science and technology made by English Puritans in the 17th century. And indeed, this book by John Morgan, published quite recently, Godly Learning, about the role of Puritanism in advancing the sciences. Now, even some of the great founders of modern science held on to seriously Christian views. Isaac Newton would be one of them, for example. But another one, of course, was the famous Robert Boyle, famous for Boyle's Law, who, in seeing the great clock, here's a bit of that wonderful great clock at Strasbourg, Boyle had this to say, and it's a little bit of a long quotation, but I'll read it nonetheless. The world is like a rare clock, such as that at Strasbourg, where all things are so skillfully contrived, and that the engine, being once set in motion, all things proceed according to the artificer's first design. That is, according to, in this case, God's design. And the motions of the little statues that at such hours perform these or those things do not require particular intervention, and so on. He likens the complexity but beauty of the cosmos, the beauty of the world, to the operations of this clock, which is set in motion by a great clockmaker, a great architect, a great builder. And for Boyle, of course, that great builder was God himself. So the idea of there being conflict would not have applied to someone like Isaac Newton or to Robert Boyle or any of those figures. This is just to say that an alternative story is a story of cooperation. Now, personally, I'm not convinced that either of those are the only way to think about it. Another way that is frequently thought about the relation between science and faith is what you might call complementarity. This has become quite popular in Christian circles, which is where they complement each other. Faith brings something from the world of worship, values, virtues, ethics, and science brings something from the world of studying the natural processes of the natural world. And one of the great champions of this was Stephen Jay Gould in what he called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, where he argued these were two realms that never should interact. They should never get mixed up with each other. They should be kept separate because they contribute different things to human well-being. That seems a mistake to me. I think that the call is much more to see how Christian faith should interact with, inform, and even on some occasions judge science, not keeping them in two separate spheres. Now, I've only two other quick ways of telling this story before I turn to what I think some of the real problems of science and faith are in our own era. And this one I'm going to call, it's a slightly more conceptually demanding, competition. A competition between science and faith. Let me illustrate this by turning to a very, very interesting little article that was written way back in the 1990s, I think, by a historian called Frank Miller Turner. And here is Frank Miller Turner, brilliant historian, deceased some years ago, with this remarkable article. I'll read the title: Rainfall, Plagues, and the Prince of Wales, a chapter in the conflict of religion and science. Now, what was he talking about with respect to rainfall, plagues, and the Prince of Wales? Well, the story goes like this. In Victorian England, three things afflicted Victorian society. The first was a lack of rainfall brought about a sequence of very poor harvests. And so people were concerned about food supply, the food supply chain, and were concerned about storing grain and things of that sort for the winter. Rainfall, insufficient, brought about agricultural problems. Secondly, plagues. In Victorian England, there was an outbreak of cattle plague. And all sorts of cattle had to be slaughtered, much as we saw some years ago whenever there were problems with cattle in Britain and so on. And this was a real crisis for the entire agricultural community. And then thirdly, the Prince of Wales had come down with, I think it was typhoid. His life was in serious danger, and this was a crisis for the nation. Now, what's this to do with a competition between science and religion? Well, of course, the clergymen were calling the government to call for a day of prayer and national mourning, national repentance, in the hope that God would remove the plague, bring sufficient rainfall, and of course bring healing to the royal household. The scientists were saying, no, we need better science. We need to know more about agriculture. We need to know more about epidemic diseases. We need to know more about how we would control plagues and things of that sort. A competition, as Turner sees it, for who was going to have the most power in society: the clergy or the professional scientist? Was it going to be the church community or the new emerging world of scientific expertise? I don't think it's hard to answer the question about which one won out. Let me say to you, when you get sick, what's the first thing you do? Now, maybe you don't do it now, because anytime I phone my GP, they'll tell me they'll phone me back in 3 weeks' time. But is your instinct to pray or to turn to the GP, turn to the tablets, turn to the experts? I think it's true to say that in the long run, in our culture, people turn to the medical experts, not to a day of prayer. Now, whether that's the right or wrong thing to do, I'm not interested in discussing at this point, but I'm saying that in our culture, we turn to the scientific expert much more quickly than we do turn to faith or turn to God. And this is why Frank Miller Turner said that we shouldn't think of this as a conflict between science and religion at all in the 19th century. We should think of it as a social competition between clergymen and scientists for who is going to have the greatest control in the society. And of course, progressively, the scientists have won out. So we've got several stories here. Notice I'm a Presbyterian, and so we've had all C's so far: conflict, cooperation, complementarity, competition, and now finally continuity. I think this is conceptually probably the most tricky one, but I think it's also the most interesting one. A particular historian, Robert Young was his name, Bob Young, he's come up with a very, very interesting way of thinking about the development of science and faith during the 19th and on into the 20th century. And his argument goes something like this. I go back to an old hymn to illustrate this. Maybe you sing this in Kirkpatrick. Cecil Francis Alexander. Do you know the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful? And you know that verse that I'm worried about, don't you? Or do you? All creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Will we sing the next verse? Cecil, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. So if you're poor, it's not because of the circumstances you were born in. It's because God made you poor. And if you're living in a rich castle, according to this hymn, it's because God ordered that you would live as a rich man or woman, I have to say, in a castle. In other words, what this hymn is here doing at this particular point is it is preaching a social philosophy, a way in which society has been ordered by the divine hand. And what Bob Young had to say was that in the early part of the century, the existing social world was justified by reference to the Creator. In the second half of the 19th century, it was justified because science, nature had made it that way. But underlying it, the same continuity of manipulating the poor, giving the rich people either the natural right or the divine right to live in the places that they enjoyed and to enjoy the riches of this earth. So he saw a fundamental continuity between faith and science in this particular period. Not surprising for a Marxist historian of science, but one that I think Christians have to think very seriously about as to whether or not we see where the evils of our socially divided society, where they are to be found. So you can take your pick as to which of those stories you want to tell, but I'm going to focus tonight now on the challenge that we've got from scientism and one or two remarks about this. I think the first thing that what we find now is that people are, in the scientific community and elsewhere, finding a conflict where it isn't. That's our first mistake. Trying to see where there's a conflict between faith and the scientific world where there really isn't one. And I've got a couple of stories that I think will illustrate this quite well. I think one of the great philosophers of the 20th century was the American, I would say, philosopher of mind, Jerry Fodor, who taught at Rutgers University in the United States. Fodor is a formidable intellect. Towards the end of his career, he died just a couple of years ago, and I was so enthusiastic about Fodor. I actually went to see him and had a great lunch with him where I felt like a first-year undergraduate student sitting with this truly great thinker. But he and a colleague, Massimo Piatelli, wrote this book here called What Darwin Got Wrong. And this was very interesting because Fodor is absolutely an evolutionist. He also is, as he described himself, an atheist, no holds barred. So there's no religion that's at stake in this book that that Fodor was writing about. It was a philosophical critique of some aspects of Darwin's theory. I'll not get into them. If you want to ask questions about it afterwards, I can bore you for a long time on that one. But what was quite interesting is whenever Massimo Piatelli Palmerini brought this book out with Fodor, it was the response of the scientific community to this that was astonishing. One reviewer, now here we're speaking about one of the finest philosophers of mind of the 20th century, described him as a mind creationist. Now here's somebody who says that he has no interest in religion, no holds barred atheist. He said, I thought that would have been clear enough. But people, because he raised any question about Darwinism, was dubbed a mind creationist. That this book would be picked up by the fundamentalist enemies of science was something that worried many of the scientific practitioners. That he was hallucinating. That these were two critics without a clue. Now, what you had here really was not an attack on Fodor's ideas, but an attack on Fodor because he raised any questions at all about the truth of a particular scientific theory. In other words, they wanted to find a justification for a conflict where no conflict really existed whatsoever. They imputed, if you like, imported a conflict into their thinking about what Fodor had to say, where he had no interest in producing it whatsoever. Now, I'm going to mention a colleague of mine who taught with me at Queen's University for many years before he went to the University of St Andrews, Professor Keith Bennett. Keith has no interest in religion at all, as far as I know, but Keith, at any rate, is an extremely good paleobotanist and has written widely about ancient plants, ancient climate change, and things of that sort. So he received a merit award from the Royal Society for the originality of his work, and he went to a conference at the Royal Society and wrote up an article from it, appeared in the front page of the New Scientist. Now, in this, he again challenged a small aspect of the modern evolutionary paradigm. It was something to do with adaptation. And this is what his critics had to say. One of them, being Jerry Coyne, described Keith as stupid, thoughtless, rotten, hogwash, moron. You might not think that was particularly scientific language, though it did appear in a scientific journal, because Coyne is out to so defend the sacredness of particular theories that he will not tolerate any view that challenges his own perspective, which you would have thought is what science is about, as a matter of fact, challenging one another about particular views. In fact, the editor of the New Scientist was, oh yes, I forgot Drivel, didn't I? Just so you know what he really thinks. The editor of the journal had this to say: Keith Bennett wasn't the only one to question the primacy of natural selection and macroevolution. I was at Bennett's talk. The room was full of learned and eminent people. He took a few questions and there were no howls of protest like yours, he wrote back to Roger Highfield, the editor. So I think this is a case of where people are willing to find conflict where it really doesn't exist. But the challenge of scientism is my topic tonight, and I want to identify 2 or 3 areas where I think there really are challenges for the church and for the scientific community. There are many, many of these, and I've just picked out 2 or 3 of the ones that I happen to be interested in. And interesting, they are all problems that Stephen Williams can answer questions on much, much better than I can. So we'll get to these. First is universal acid. I'm not sure if any of you have read this book, but I suppose one of the greatest evolutionary atheists in the 20th century and still today in the 21st century is Daniel Dennett. Dennett's an eminent philosopher, a brilliant philosopher, but really has a hatred of faith, deep in his psyche, maybe deep in his genetic system. And he wrote this book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And what he was really interested in was what he calls universal acid. Darwin's wonderful idea is so powerful that it explains absolutely everything. This is what he has to say. Darwin's universal acid, it eats through just about every traditional concept, by which he means traditionally religious concept, and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview. It's supposed to be an acid that seeps through absolutely everything, presuming also including the container that the acid is actually in. It just seeps through every traditional idea that you have, every idea about virtue, every idea about ethics, morality. All of this is all explicable with reference to Darwin's universal acid. Now, I've been describing this as universal acid, and it has become unbelievably popular in certain aspects of modern science. I'm going to put up a few quotations that I think are incredibly ridiculous, but they are actually taken from scientific journals of how people are thinking that this one idea explains just about everything. Here are some of them. Darwin's universal acid. Why don't we approve of eating grandmother? We don't because having her around to babysit was useful in the hunter-gatherer society. So now, as a grandfather, I have to tell you that I'm delighted that we don't approve of that. But this is because we can give it an adaptationist account. We can give it an evolutionary account. We like music. Not because of the sublimity of the harmonic cadences, but because singing together strengthened the bond between the hunters and the gatherers in the past. You see, they're finding a function for absolutely everything, an adaptive function. We talk by making noises and not by waving our hands. That's because hunter-gatherers lived in the savannah and would have had trouble seeing one another in the tall grass. This is an evolutionary explanation for why we have language. We don't all talk the same language because that would make us more likely to interbreed with foreigners, which would be bad because it would weaken the ties of hunter-gatherer communities. Now, this is universal acid, one idea that is being used to explain just everything about you and about me. I don't know what you think about it. I feel quite uncomfortable about this, because I think it is dehumanizing. It is degrading to the human agent to explain just everything about us in this language of Darwin's universal acid. So, I think that this is really close to a second moment of conflict, which is what I'm calling reductionism, that everything can be reduced just to evolutionary impulses, just to the struggle for existence, just to trying to survive and to reproduce. And I think one of the great champions of this is, if I can go back to him again, Richard Dawkins. Everything about humanity can be reduced just to genetic interactions. Life is just bytes and bytes and bytes of digital information. We, and that means all living things, are survival machines programmed to propagate the digital database that did the programming. Now, this looks to me to be an impoverished view of the human subject. It looks to me to be a highly reduced view to saying that you and I are nothing but bits of information. In fact, he went so far at one point to say a monkey is a machine that preserves genes up a tree. A fish is a machine that preserves genes in the water. This is reducing you and me and all organic life, not to questions of beauty, purpose, or anything of that sort, but simply to do with genetic bits of data, reducing it to the lowest common denominator. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that there are not elements to us that can be described in the language of bytes of digital information. I'm sure there's some truth in that. But to think that this is a universal truth to think that this is a whole description of what the complexity and beauty of human life is, seems to me to be a challenge that the Christian church has to combat. Because if we treat people and organisms like bits of information, you might be inclined to think that we might dehumanize them in that very prospect. How science has shifted our sense of identity. A historian commenting on this says, since the Enlightenment, we have tended to define human identity and worth in terms of the values of science itself, as if it alone could tell us who we are. This is an odd and blinkered notion, and this is where I get the title of my talk tonight. The problem is scientism, defining the human self only in biological terms tends to obscure other forms of identity. I found that a very helpful thought when we are encountering this impulse to reduce us to nothing but bytes and bytes of information. Now there's a rather significant, potentially significant, and Stephen really will be talking about relevant matters about this in a couple of weeks' time, very significant fallout for this, for our culture more generally. A few years ago, an article appeared with this rather inflated title, The Lucretian Swerve, the biological basis of human behavior in the criminal justice system. This paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And this was because a very, very eminent lawyer had been elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Believe me, not an easy thing to do, not an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination. This writer is a world leader. But I read this I was a bit concerned that the technicalities would be way too much for me. It turned out not to be very technical at all. I just want to pick out two little elements in it, which I think have got enormous cultural and political significance. Let us see what will happen in the future. The reality is, on the basis of us being nothing but genes and nothing but bits of information, the reality is not only do we have no more free will than a fly or a bacterium, in actuality, we have no more free will than a bowl of sugar. The laws of nature are uniform throughout, and these laws do not accommodate the concept of free will. You don't have free will. You are a bowl of sugar, like a bowl of sugar. Nothing but bits and bits of data or bits and bits of material. Now, you can imagine as a lawyer writing. This is not a biologist. What are the implications for being a lawyer if you think of human beings as this? Well, he tells us. Progress in understanding the chemical basis of behavior will make it increasingly untenable to retain a belief in the concept of free will. To retain any degree of reality, the criminal justice system will need to adjust accordingly. A person won't be guilty or innocent for doing X, Y, and Z, because they have no more free will than a bowl of sugar. So any concept of right or wrong, or any concept that you had a choice to make a good choice or to not make a good choice, is completely eroded by this form of, I would call it, neurological determinism, to get fancy about it. But this is a real challenge to whether or not we have freedom to make moral choices. And I think this is now something in which the scientific mentality is penetrating right into our thinking about right and wrong, good and bad, ethical virtues or vices. They make no sense. It's all just to do with how your brain is firing, or what the chemistry is in there. Evolutionary ethics. Well, it's not too hard to think that all of this might well have some kind of implication for what we think about beliefs, what we think about ethics. My good friend Michael Roos, who's teaching at the Florida University in Tallahassee, Michael is an extremist, that's for sure, but he's influential. And when Michael Roos says this, morality is a collective illusion foisted upon us by our genes, what he's really saying is that you think there are moral actions. You think that there are some things that are good and bad, but you really have no basis for that whatsoever. There is no morality. It's an illusion. It's foisted on you by the DNA, by your makeup. It's nothing to do with any process of thinking, any historical development or whatever. It's all an illusion. This is where I think scientism is really becoming deeply problematic. Of course, there are some scientists who have developed this thing called evolutionary ethics, and that means that they judge every piece of behavior on one criterion: whether it helps us survive or not. If something helps the race survive, it's good. If it helps it disappear or would disappear, it's not good. Now, can you think about every ethical decision you make, that it really should be judged by this simple thing: does it lead to greater survival for the human race or not? Seems to me this is a very, very truncated, a very anorexic, a very, very slimmed down version of what moral behavior really should be. And I'll not say anything very much about this last fancy term. Paul instructed me that I'd better be finished by 1:15, and we're leaving 10 minutes for questions. We're doing all right. This is just an application of this to ideas about knowledge. And I think what this idea of an evolutionary theory of knowledge, I think one of the problems is that they simply say that the only things that are true are the things that will survive. So if a belief survives long enough, then it's true. And if it doesn't survive, it's false. Now, this seems to me to be a complete mistake, thinking about truth as merely something that will survive or not. And it was critiqued, I think, wouldn't it have been Mary Midgley had some very, very interesting, Marjorie Green. I think Mary Midgley too had some things to say about this, Stephen, but Marjorie Green, I think, and you need to think carefully about this sentence that's composed of very simple words, but is conceptually very, very challenging. When we say we know something, we are not saying it is true because it will survive, but contrariwise, it will survive because it is true. I should just let you sit and ponder that for the next 10 minutes and see if you can come up with what you think Marjorie Green is really saying. So that's those I think of as the challenges. Let's not worry about that. To where the conflict really does lie. I think it's to do with human freedom. I think it's to do with whether we're just bits of information. I think it's to do with where do our values come from. Do we believe that God has revealed to us moral standards, or do we think they've just come about as a consequence of evolutionary mechanisms? I think the church really has to think very seriously about these in our increasingly secular age. But I want to conclude with three final voices, people who I think, including some of the ones I've mentioned, who have said things that I think are very helpful at a time when this hurricane of scientism is ripping its way through parts of our culture. Terry Eagleton, literary critic, and I think agnostic, but has this to say: imagine someone holding forth in biology whose only knowledge of the subject is the Book of British Birds, and you have a rough idea of what it feels like to read Richard Dawkins on theology. And that's quite true. An awful lot of people talking about religion in these simplistic terms have never really bothered to sit down and study any theology at all. What they've done is that they've taken caricatures and they have applied these without any deep pondering on the nature of the history of the Christian church, great works of theology and things of that sort. So in the middle of all this, there's a remarkable superficiality. I'll not worry about what he said there. Michael Roos, whom I've criticized a minute ago, said this, and I think it's quite good in what he thinks about Richard Dawkins. The paradox is that an evolutionist like Dawkins should be more modest. He stresses that we are the product of Darwinian evolution, and hence there's no good reason to think that we have the power to penetrate into the mysteries of the universe. In a way, the Darwinian is back to back with St. Paul. We peer through a glass darkly. If we have just got here by means of survival, by means of just able to reproduce more successfully than others, Are we really good creatures to be able to penetrate the mysteries of the universe? Dawkins should be a little more humble, I think, is what Michael Roos is saying. And then H. Alan Orr, and I'll finish with this. The most disappointing feature is their failure to engage religious thought in any serious way. This reflects Richard Dawkins' cavalier attitude about the quality of religious thinking. You will find no serious examination of Christian or Jewish theology in his book. No attempt to follow the philosophical debates about the nature of religious propositions. No effort to appreciate the complex history of the interaction between the church and science, and no attempt to understand even the simplest of religious attitudes. I think that this is a major problem for our education system. This would be 30 years ago. I remember teaching a course and putting up on the board a map of the known world. Simple map, and there were 3 words on it: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sem, you get Semites. Ham, you got Hamites, black people. Japheth, Japhethites, white people, and all that. Not a single kid in the class knew that these were the sons of Noah. Not a single one of them knew it was a biblical reference, because, and I think this is being called for by Alan Orr, our education system needs to take much more seriously the role of religion, the role of faith in the history of our own culture, whether a person is committed to it or not. So that's my first attempt to have a go at the challenge of scientism, and I'd love to have your questions and answers. And Paul, you're going to field these and save me from difficult questions. Am I all right for time? 4 minutes to coffee. All right, okay. I'll worry about that in the meantime.
Is this on, Noah? Just to pick up people's questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask David tonight? There we go. Thank you, Noah. Anyone got a question? Okay. Yeah. Go on, Mike. I knew I could rely on you, Mike.
Could you argue that it's just a smokescreen in some ways, that scientism is just a new faith?
It's just a new faith.
It's a new faith that has its own liturgy and temples and all the rest of it, but we've pushed Christ off the throne. We're not worshipping, but we're just worshipping a new idol, but it's a faith all the same.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Everybody hear the question. That scientism is just a sort of a new faith with its own temples and things of that sort. Maybe suggesting that's been a long-standing thing, but that now we're worshipping the new science. Well, I'd say 2 things about that. One is that I think there's a lot to be said for what you're saying here, not only for our own time, but many of you, I suspect, when you've been in London, have visited the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. Do you know what it was called whenever it was first constructed in the 1830s? The Cathedral of Nature. It was built to look very much like a Gothic church, like a Gothic cathedral. And it was as though there was a shift from the church as a place of worshipping to nature. Now, this is tied up with much, much broader concepts in Europe about the idea of nature at the time. But I think that is really the beginnings of a new kind of metaphysical view of the world, a new, let's say, religious consciousness, where a lot of the vocabulary of religion and so on was imported into the new theories about the philosophy of nature. So whether it's just that, I think there's probably more to it, one of which is probably money and how you can get funding for your research and so on. But I think that there's something to what you're saying, yeah.
David, thank you. We have people at the door wanting tea and coffee because we're hosting it in this room. I thought we would get in first before them, so we're going to stop.
This is the survival of the fittest.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to stop it there. But David, thank you so much for that tonight. I'm very happy to take the blame for you being here, and we look forward to a fortnight's time when we'll think about the challenge of environmentalism. And do hold on to your questions, folks. In week 5, we will have a chance to have a proper conversation with David and Stephen about all sorts of things. And grab your tea and coffee before the others get in.
What's your question?
No, I've got a few questions, but I might save them to week 5. If you send me your PowerPoint, I might just for the YouTube, people won't be able to see your slides.
Yeah, sure, I can
But I could splice them in between your talk.
The only question would be, I think I should maybe just give you right now my memory stick
Because it's so large.
because it's so large.
Well, sure, I'll not take it tonight.